Hi everyone, and welcome to Southasiasphere, Himal Southasian's monthly roundup of news events and developing stories across South Asia. I'm Raisa, and I'm joined by my colleagues Shubhanga, Marlon, and Shweta. Hi guys.
Hello.
Hi.
Hi.
So, our big story in this edition is the recent resurgence of Me Too in Sri Lanka's newsrooms and looking at proposed solutions to sexual harassment across the region. In Around South Asia in 5 minutes, we're talking about Twitter losing legal protection in India and its display of a distorted map of the country, military corruption, and jade mining in Myanmar, and Bangladesh's journey out of LDC status and Afghan border control. Let's begin with Me Too.
Thanks, Raisa. So last month in June, a number of women journalists from Sri Lanka and some non-Sri Lankans who had worked in Sri Lanka's newsrooms in the past posted a number of stories on Twitter of the sexual harassment they faced while at work. Now, this included a range of incidents, some from several years back, some more recent. But the key message was that sexual harassment has been going on and continues to be a serious problem in Sri Lankan media industry. Now, most media outlets reporting on these tweets and responses to them have called it, Me Too movement finally making some dent in the country. Although it should be mentioned that similar efforts to start conversations around sexual harassment in workplace, they've been made in the past, those efforts, but they didn't really have the same kind of media impact we're seeing now. But I think the other important point that came across in these conversations was also that, a lot of these incidents have gone largely unpunished or have not even been investigated because many in the media sector or the media fraternity continue to defend the harassers or undermine the allegations. In some cases, it was also clear that women facing abuse and harassment are often silent because of fear of legal reprisals, even when allegations and perpetrators were unnamed.
Exactly, Shobhanga. Now, this issue was actually raised to the Minister of Mass Media, Keheliya Rambukwella, at a briefing on the 23rd of June. The minister said that there has not been any official complaint so far, and if there is a complaint, the ministry would investigate and take action. But it seemed he was quite unaware of what was going on.
Yes, Marlon, and this lack of awareness seems to be a bit of a trend among government officials in the South Asian region. I guess we all remember Imran Khan's recent comments in an interview noting that women wearing little clothing was a contributing factor to rape, which has created public outcry across Pakistan.
Yes, Raisa, it's quite a disturbing trend. So, back to the minister's statement. It led to news outlets here and around the world who reported that the ministry would take action and launch a formal investigation. But on the 29th, the minister clarified his statement, stating that the ministry will not launch an investigation based on social media reports unless a formal complaint is made to the police or the media ministry. He also said that launching an investigation into any media institution without a formal complaint will be seen as interfering in the media.
Yes, and I have to say, I don't think I've ever heard the media ministry sound so concerned about media interference, but glad to hear that they're concerned about it. But yeah, so right now several solutions have been proposed in Sri Lanka. A number of people, for example, have been talking about introducing sexual harassment policies in newsrooms. Now, there's been an IFJ report from 2015 on media and gender focused on Sri Lanka, which noted that only 12.5% of the survey respondents had access to a kind of an official complaint cell or a sexual harassment policy at their workplace. Over 57% of women who responded and 42% of men had no such mechanism in their newsrooms. So as a result, people have been talking about perhaps drafting sexual harassment policies for their workplaces. Apart from that, the Sri Lanka Young Journalists Association also wrote to the Government Information Department and they called for an impartial ombudsman to handle cases of sexual harassment. Now, personally, I have to say I'm a little skeptical of government involvement in these processes. The Young Journalists Association did call for impartiality, but given the kind of politicization of bodies like the Press Council, it's not clear whether they would actually be able to achieve this impartiality. Not to mention Kehelia Rambukwala's kind of lukewarm response. So I'm personally a bit skeptical of that. But another important thing that they did point out in that letter was that harassment is also pervasive in Sinhala and Tamil media, and that hasn't yet kind of come out. So that was an important aspect that was discussed. Apart from that, there have also been calls to expedite the ratification of ILO's Convention 190, which protects workers from gender-based violence and harassment. Sri Lanka is actually in the process of ratifying it, but the process has been delayed. So this kind of spate of stories has now revived conversations to push that through a bit faster.
And if we look at the mechanisms in place in India, for example, in 2013, India enacted the Sexual Harassment of Women at the Workplace Act to protect workers in both formal and informal sectors. Now, this act was a significant legislative step for India, but for most women workers, especially those in the informal sector, the government enforcement of this law is quite weak. And there was a Human Rights Watch report from last year that finds that while women in India are increasingly speaking out against sexual abuse at work, many, particularly in the informal sector, are still constrained by stigma, fear of retribution, and institutional barriers. The report also highlighted some key recommendations where the government should, in collaboration with civil society organizations, activists, and trade unions, enforce this act, monitor the operation of committees, sanctioning employers who fail to comply, and ensuring access to remedies for victims, including complaint mechanisms and compensation.
So looking at the mechanisms that exist in Pakistan, in 2010, Pakistan introduced the Protection Against Harassment of Women at Workplace Act, which stipulates all public and private organizations to adopt an internal code of conduct and complaint appeals mechanism aimed at establishing a safe working environment free of intimidation and abuse for all working women.
In a survey conducted by the Dawn newspaper in 2018, it was found that 35% were told to remain silent by their colleagues and bosses about workplace sexual harassment. And when it comes to formal reporting mechanisms, only 17% of those who experienced harassment approached their organization's internal inquiry committees, which suggests a lack of faith in the process.
You're right, Shweta, and I think this lack of faith is understandable, given how even the legislation has been weaponized against such allegations. I mean, if we take the Misha Shafi case, which is the most high-profile Me Too case in Pakistan, Ali Zafar, the alleged harasser, has filed a defamation case under the Civil Defamation Ordinance 2002 and then filed a complaint to the Federal Investigation Agency's Cybercrime Wing under the Prevention of Electronic Crimes Act. Now, in 2020, the FIA booked Shafi and 8 others, and since then, one of the women who was part of the case has issued an apology, and then her name has been retracted from the case.
That's right, Marlon. And you can see that even in the Sri Lankan case, those who have followed formal processes have not seen redress. So in Sri Lanka, there's the case of Mihiri De Silva, who did report harassment to the head of her HR department and to senior management. And there were no consequences for the perpetrator, leading to her leaving her position at a top corporate. But we're also seeing this worldwide more recently with the overturn of Bill Cosby's sexual assault conviction due to the violation of his due process rights, and of course the acquittal of the Tehelka editor Tarun Tejpal. So in that sense, Rambukwala's promise of investigations into formal complaints is kind of an empty one. In Sri Lanka, there's also been more recent discussion that sexual harassment policies will do little by way of protection unless underlying issues of sexism are addressed. And that's definitely true. But it's also telling that despite many journalists, including the Young Journalists Association, agreeing that sexual harassment is a pervasive issue, no one has kind of discussed possible methods of redress or protection for workers.
Yeah, and the point about institutional solutions reminds me of a recent case in Nepal where this journalist who used to work at an English language daily wrote on Twitter about her being sexually harassed and threatened by a frequent contributor to the newspaper, and that she told her editor about it. Now, this contributor was not an employee but a freelance writer. But regardless of that, what was quite shocking was that she never actually got a response from her editor or the organization on this matter. And maybe it was easier for them to do that because, the perpetrator was not employed by the newspaper. Now, some people and organizations working on this issue have made the point that it's important to bring, protections against sexual harassment within the larger ambit of labor protections. And that enforcement of anti-harassment policies need to be part of, broader workplace rights. And it's not a separate entity. Also, given the fact that governments in the region have been quite willing to weaken labor protection, it's unfortunate, but maybe at this point essential for professional groups and unions to actually start working on these more structural and institutional responses to the issue.
Speaking purely from my experiences, I know that international organizations, when they employ you as an external party, say for on a freelance basis or for a consultancy, in addition to the contract, you are made aware of the workplace sexual harassment policies, child protection laws, and I think this should be the standard for every organization
Right.
who employs external parties. Big corporates, they have extensive procurement policies where their suppliers have to be responsible, accountable, when it comes to, sustainable procurement, etc. So the case that you alluded to, Shubhanga, about the freelance journalist in Nepal, I don't see why these policies should not be applicable to freelancers as well. So that these parties, they need to be aware, all parties, they need to be aware, responsible, and accountable.
Yeah. And, with so many people working remotely now and, just the changing nature of the workspace, maybe that's the way to go. So moving on to our next segment around South Asia in 5 minutes. Raisa, you want to start?
Yes, so on June 16th, the Union government in India circulated a statement noting that Twitter had lost its legal protection for third-party content for failing to adhere to the IT rules. Now, this means that instead of being considered just a platform hosting content from various users, Twitter will be held directly and editorially responsible for any post published on its platform. Shortly before the announcement, the Uttar Pradesh police named Twitter in an FIR, along with 7 others, including journalists, for spreading misinformation on the attack on a 70-year-old Muslim man in Ghaziabad. But internet right groups say it's not in the government's power to revoke Twitter's status as an intermediary. Digital rights group Internet Freedom Foundation explained that the intermediary status is not a registration that is granted by the government, but rather it's a technical qualification which is conferred under the IT Act.
And another incident in this ongoing standoff between Twitter and the government were the recent charges against Twitter India for posting a map that showed Kashmir as a separate country. Now, even after they took this map down, they're still facing charges.
So over in Bangladesh, the government is making preparations for its graduation from an LDC, a least developed country, into a developing country. Now, according to the United Nations Capital Development Fund, and according to their recommendation, the transition will be effective in 2026. It means until 2026, Bangladesh will be able to enjoy all these benefits that are applicable to LDCs, like duty-free quota for exports, favorable intellectual property rights, and foreign aid. And as you might know, we are currently working on a special series of articles to commemorate Bangladesh's 50th year since independence. Watch this space and go to our website for more information.
And in Myanmar, efforts to minimize the human and environmental cost of jade mining and trade is now at the risk of being undone, with the military and armed groups tightening their grip on this lucrative mineral resource. This is according to the latest report by Global Witness, which is an international organization that looks at the intersection of natural resources, conflict, and human rights. This is not the first such report to be done on jade mining in Myanmar, and the dangerous impact of this jade extraction and trade on people living mostly in Kachin state in northern Myanmar. It's been extensively reported. We also did a story on this in 2019 after a mining disaster killed over 50 workers. But apart from this, jade trade also finances conflict in the region, and it's a major source of revenue for the army, which basically owns several mining operations and licenses. So now that the military government is in power, the concern is that this will basically allow them to revert all the reforms made by the civilian government over the last few years on this matter.
And with the US troops withdrawing from Afghanistan faster than anticipated, the Taliban has captured Afghanistan's main border crossing with Tajikistan, which was important because it controls the trade between Afghanistan and the rest of Central Asia. And after a series of takeovers in other districts throughout June, about 5,000 Afghan families have fled their homes in the city of Kunduz in northern Afghanistan. And now we'll be moving on to our culture section, Bookmarked, where we'll be talking about a Malayalam film called Great Indian Kitchen and the Telugu language comedy Cinema Bandi. I'll start with my recommendation for the month, which is the Telugu indie comedy Cinema Bandi, directed by Praveen Kandragulla and produced by Raj and DK. Cinema Bandi is a simple, light-hearted film with lots of snarky humor, and the film is set in Golapalli, a small village on the Andhra-Karnataka border. Now in this village, there's a lot of issues where, it hasn't rained in years, and there's frequent power cuts, and young people are migrating to big cities. And Veera, this auto rickshaw driver, he finds a camera left behind in his vehicle, and the story essentially follows his journey together with this quirky film crew that he gathers, consisting of the village wedding photographer Ghana, a barber called Maridesh, and to their journey to cast and shoot this film. And Marlon and Riza, you guys have watched this film as well. What did you guys think?
Yeah, I really liked it. I liked how funny it was, and I really enjoyed the kind of innovativeness of the crew and how they kind of use the tools around them to try to get really interesting shots.
Yeah, like waiting for the rain, I think.
Yeah. Yeah, waiting for the rain. And even, the pulley system that they created to kind of get high shots. Yeah. I thought that was so clever and funny. And I also kind of enjoyed how it kind of, without being preachy about it, it showed as you mentioned, Shweta, the deprivation in the village by just showing the obstacles they had to overcome just to charge the camera, for example. So I thought that was really interesting, and it was a really funny film. I enjoyed it a lot.
Yeah, so I found it charming, and I did find it funny, but I didn't like it that much. I mean, of course, you have the juxtaposition of class and poverty, and this noble act of creating a film to uplift the community. I got all of that, but it just felt like, I don't want to be mean, but I actually thought, the premise of the story is that the tuk driver finds a good camera and tries to shoot a film in his village. I just kept thinking that maybe the director of the film just found a good camera and just decided to make a film. So, yeah.
I mean, one thing that I will say is that I thought the ending was a little bit kumbaya in the sense that, it kind of felt like, they had such dreams for, which was also nice. They were dreaming about being able to bring change in the village. And then that clash between the person whose camera is stolen and the villagers was interesting. But then I didn't feel like it was properly resolved. Like, I didn't feel that. I was like, what happens after that? Are they going to like screen it in a cinema, and like what happened?
Yeah, the ending was definitely too perfect. Too neat.
Yeah, it was a bit kumbaya. That was my main this thing, but I did find it like kind of funny and fun.
Yeah, it was funny. I mean, like, I love the photographer. His classic shot, the Titanic shot. It takes some. I didn't get it at first. I was like, "What is this guy doing?" But then, I think it's mentioned at one point, and I'm like, yes.
It's also so relatable because if you look here, like the wedding photographers here, they also have these classic poses, right? Like, which are like, the Titanic poses and like the noses touching. So that made me really like laugh because it's familiar. So yeah.
These are wedding shots, are these?
Yeah.
Yeah, because he's a wedding photographer.
So he's the guy who was like, he's like kind of recruited to make the film. So he has to like change the medium basically.
Yeah, and that was also the funny part. Like when he's shooting, first he just goes to what he knows.
Yeah.
So he's like asking the actor and the actress to do that Titanic pose. And then the person kind of cuts in and says, "What are you doing? Just follow the script." That was also pretty funny because it was like, okay, I'm just going to do it.
And the scriptwriter was quite funny too, right? That the guy, is just there. Does he speak at the end? I was just like waiting for him to say
he does.
something.
He says that he didn't write.
He does, right?
He basically implies that he didn't write it.
Yeah. Right.
Which again, that was another thing. I was like, who wrote it then? Anyways, but yeah.
Yeah. So it seems I did like it, but I didn't like it that much. Like the acting and all, I just couldn't like get into the spirit of it. But yeah.
So my recommendation for the month is also a film on marriage, but it's not funny at all. So it's a Malayalam language film called Great Indian Kitchen, directed by Joe Baby. I think it's on Amazon India if I'm not wrong, but it came out recently and it's being reviewed everywhere, and it's getting good reviews. So it's basically about a woman who has an arranged marriage and whose life gets completely transformed when she starts living basically with her husband's family, and she ends up doing all the domestic labor of the household. So it's kind of the movie is basically a critique of marriage and the predominant form of marriage maybe in large parts of South Asia, and kind of I think makes a point that for many women marriage basically is a form of labor obligation to this new household you find yourself in. So it's quite powerful. It's it has, I think Raisa, you've also watched it, and there are other aspects of the movie also, but that was, the labor aspect was what really got me, and especially those shots of the mess that people make after the meal and someone else has to clean up on it, and I was like, okay, finally someone has made a film about South Asian men kind of leaving a mess after the meal and not cleaning it up. And you see what happens after that.
Yeah, it's always the scrumptious feast, right? It's like the banquet. You don't see the afterwards, like in films. And stuff.
Exactly. And in this case, it's a household. So it's someone who has to deal with it, several times a day, every day. But yeah, the ending of the movie was, I think, like Cinema Bandi, a bit too perfect. But Raisa, what did you think of the film?
Yeah, I also I feel like it really brought this. I think the term that is often used is like unpaid care work. It kind of brought that into the foreground, and it really showed how much like additional tasks and kind of chores that women often have to take on in the context of marriage. But in this film, it was in the context of marriage, and it was quite slow building. Like it went on for quite a long time, and not much kind of happened. It just really focused in on just the daily repetition of these tasks and like the stress kind of building up. And then, it just suddenly started escalating. And again, the ending was a bit too neat perhaps. But I kind of thought that it made a really important point, and it kind of brought this like invisible labor into the limelight in a sense. So that was pretty interesting.
Yeah, and they tried to kind of relate it to also some recent political events. I guess the Sabrimala episode where women were not allowed to go to temples because they could potentially, pollute the temple by being in period. But the movie isn't about that episode. It's about this woman again facing kind of constraints in the household during period. But that was kind of the latter half of the film, I guess.
Yeah, that was definitely interesting as well. And yeah, you could see that judgment was kind of unfolding in the backdrop. And then, she was also negotiating what that meant for her as like someone who's like supposed to be kind of doing all these tasks. But that was also interesting, the way that even then it was just passed off to somebody else, and it was just this endless cycle of like these tasks that had to be completed. So I thought that was also quite interesting. And it's also relevant to Sri Lanka because we do have similar practices here, not necessarily about like temple entry, but there's quite a few children who don't go to school, for example, when they get their period. And so I was kind of thinking about that as well when I watched that part. But yeah, on that note, that's it for this edition of Southasiasphere. Do head to our website, himalmag.com, to see the cartoons illustrating this episode by Gihan Chickera. And while you're at it, check out our membership plans and support our work. Thanks, everyone. Bye.
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 For more Himal podcasts, go to himalmag.com/podcasts.